Hey guys, I am back again for the next installment of Chickadee. And I had to change some of my setup a little bit tonight because of lighting, and I'm recording in the evening, so I look a little bit different. And I'm standing behind it or in front of a chalkboard, and I have this nasty buzzing sound. But I hope we'll get through this without too much problem. Um, as we get started, I just wanted to remind us where we were at. We still haven't reunited the two twin brothers, so Chickadee and Makoons are still waiting to become um, a pair again. But Chickadee's prospects are looking up as he's found his uncle, and they're spending time riding along together in the ox cart train. And I just wanted to point out this fantastic picture. If you look at it, all the artwork. I love all the artwork from Louis Erdrich's books. So check out the artwork. I posted some of it on our Google Classroom. You can open up that PDF and take a look. Figure out who the artist is. Maybe she has an interesting story. That would be something really interesting to research, which leads me to the last thing I wanted to mention before we get started on the actual book. I have posted an assignment for any of you to do, all of you to do. I'd love to see some of your work where you take some of the themes we've looked at in the book, some of the characters, some of the places, and you do some research. You dig deeper, and you don't even have to write an essay about it. All I need from you is a PowerPoint with some facts on it, some interesting pictures, some observations you've made, and I have that all outlined for us right there on the Google Classroom. So go take a look, and we will come back to that next time, and I'll give you a few more details and a few more encouragements to get to work there. So that's that. Now I would like to open up our Kindle book, and let's see if I can find it here, and we will get to work. Get rid of our lovely picture of Chickadee's new aunt dancing. Here we go. There we go. Now, let's get started with chapter 20, I believe. Chapter 20. Chapter 20, Makoons. Ever since his father and Two Strike had returned with news that they had lost Chickadee's trail, Makoons had begun to feel the strangeness of his life. One morning, fishing for golden eyes as usual, he fell into the cold, red river. He let the current take him downstream quite a way before he roused himself, panicked, and swam wildly for the shore. After that, Makoons just felt wrong. It was the chill, Nokomis thought, and she dosed him with many cups of thick black tea. He had a cough, which she treated with boiled cherry bark. His chest hurt. Nokomis put a plaster of steaming lily pad root right over his heart. Makoons cried at the sting of the heat, but his chest cleared. Still, he dragged from place to place and could hardly manage to set one foot before the other on some days. When he sat down, he leaned over, closed his eyes, and quickly fell asleep. When he awoke, it was to the sad memory of his brother's absence. Omakayas was worried. "Come here, my boy," she said gently. "Sit with me. We are missing your brother, aren't we?" "Yes," said Makoons. "Let us sit here and think about him then," said Omakayas. Tears came into her eyes. "I know he is alive," Makoons said. "I feel his presence. I know he's looking for us." "He is strong, and he will find us," said Omakayas. "We have to be patient and wait." Makoons looked at her helplessly. Waiting was very hard. It was so difficult to stay in one place waiting for your twin, the other half of you, to show up. Any moment he might appear, or he might not appear. There was no certainty. That's what was hardest. That's what tired him. Makoons crept next to his mother, lay against her. Exhaustion crept over him. The chill from the river came back and he shivered, even though the day was warm. His mother made tea from wild rose hips, covered him with a blanket. Omakaya sang to him and stroked his hair until he slept. She was very worried. "Nokomis," she said when her grandmother appeared, "we need to make another, better, strengthening tea for Makoons. We have to feed him well. We must keep him from growing ill." "I know," said Nokomis. "I too am worried that he could pine away for his twin. I am going out to gather medicines, plant food, and watch the horizon. One day from that distance, I know our boy will appear." Nokomis took her bean seeds from the little pouch she had carried across Minnesota. Even when most of their things had been stolen, she'd saved a few seeds. She loved to make gardens and had a nose for whom to ask for seeds. She'd added to those few seeds with others that she traded for from the people of Garden Island in Lake of the Woods. All around that great and complicated lake, there had been women who planted corn, gourds, beans. Now, bending over the soft earth, Nokomis took a few bean seeds and carefully buried them. She marked each seed with a tall stick. She worked the fish bones, the heads and fins and scales into the soil between the seeds. Then she carried water in a wooden bucket to each one. It used to be, she reflected, that she could make a new container from birch bark anytime she wanted. She just had to find a tree, remove the bark, and fashion her vessel. Nokomis sighed at the memory. On the plains, there were few birch trees, and even those few had thin and crinkly skin. They made frail baskets and terrible buckets. This one wooden bucket had to do a lot of work. It was the only one they had. Angeline and Yellow Kettle straightened their backs. They were planting seed potatoes given to them by Father Belcour. At the same moment, using a saw borrowed from the priest and hinges traded for with maple sugar, Meekwam and Fishtail were making a little trap door in the wood floor of the cabin. They were digging out a root cellar, anticipating that there would be potatoes to keep there by fall. They were hauling sand to line the bottoms of the bins. They had learned that this trick kept the potatoes and squash at the right temperature all winter. After the cellar was dug and the door finished off with a rope handle, the two went out to work on the pole fences. They had put to use old poles left behind, setting them in place between shorter logs pounded into the earth. They now had a small fenced yard and a shanty for Brownie and Brownie to shelter inside when the rain poured. Otherwise, the horses were tough and grazed the grasses all around on staked lines. Their bellies grew, though one Brownie's belly was growing bigger than the others. Zosie had joined Nokomis in the garden. She pointed at the horses and said, "Nokomis, I think one of the Brownies is going to have a foal." "You're right," said Nokomis, nodding happily. "It won't be long. We are lucky that Two Strike knows what to do." Two Strike, who had taken charge of the horses, cared for them religiously. At night, she slept near them in a pile of sweet, dry grass. By day, she worked and trained them. She practiced riding, along with Makoons. As soon as possible, they planned to take those two horses and hunt buffalo. They were making friends among the other Anishinaabeg, and also among the Métis, who lived all around the town and up into the low hills. Once the Red River carts returned and the families were again together, they would follow the buffalo off into the plains and hunt them to fill those carts again. They would use each part of the buffalo and build up their winter stores of dried meat. They would make pemmican, tan hides, make beautiful fluffy robes, and keep the horns to make powder carriers, knife handles, spoons, even buttons and tobacco boxes. How Two Strike looked forward to that hunt. But even as Two Strike made plans, Makoons fell silent. His heart was heavy. He worked as hard as he could, but waiting and wondering about Chickadee weighed so heavy on his heart sometimes that he couldn't breathe. There were times when he sat with Omokayas holding her hand, neither of them saying a word hour after hour. How could they go on? Yet they did go on, waiting for their son. Chapter 21, St. Paul. The ox cart train jogged and wobbled in a sea of noise down a path that became a wide road. This road broadened and smoothed itself out and at last became a series of streets lined with wooden buildings. Chickadee sat beside Uncle Quill and looked with amazement at the ornamented tops of the buildings. There were many log cabins and many more plank houses, too, for which reason, of course, there was not a tree in sight. The signs that marked the glass windows of the stores were bright and bold, though people walked on wooden paths and stared at the ox carts and held their hands over their ears. The muddy path took them along the river where each cart would unload. As the cart jounced along, Chickadee stared up at the bluff above the river. Towering high over the slope, he saw the biggest houses in the world. They were carved of trees. Each was of a different shape and color. Great windows like staring eyes glared over the river. Doors like mouths swung open as people came out, drawn by the outrageous noise of the ox carts. The people stood high on the bluff, shading their eyes, pointing down at the carts and the drivers and the children, who shaded their eyes too and pointed right back at them. It was not polite to point. Nokomis had always stopped Chickadee from pointing at a person. "You are stabbing that person's spirit," she had told Chickadee, "and never point at clouds because there might be a thunderbird up there, or at the water because you must not challenge water, or at the islands because they also are alive." Nokomis pointed by puckering her lips and nodding at whatever she wished to indicate. Most other Anishinaabe did too. Chickadee had rarely pointed at anything or anybody in his life. But he was so astonished at those houses, which Uncle Quill called mansions, that he pointed right up at them, and nobody stopped him. Uncle Quill just smiled at his nephew's surprise. He had been in St. Paul before. The ox cart train made camp by a lake. Although he was excited to be in St. Paul, he also wanted to go home. He looked at the ground. One hawk feather, blown by the wind and trampled by passing carts, stuck raggedly out of the mud. Chickadee plucked it out of the road and carefully tucked it into his shirt. There weren't very many birds in St. Paul, but one of his helpers had passed over. One by one, each cart was unloaded at the trader's warehouse. The bales of fur were weighed, their quality assessed. The horn spoons and bowls, the baskets and quilled shirts were bargained for. Antoinette sold 7 pairs of embroidered moccasins and 8 calico shirts that she'd made on the way. She was such a quick and clever seamstress that she'd made as many on the way back to sell another batch in Pembina. Once a cart had been emptied, it would then be reloaded with things that people back home had requested from the St. Paul traders. The people up north around Pembina needed metal dishes, bolts of wool and calico, rifles, ammunition, ribbons, beads, doors, door latches, bucket handles, ingots of metal, and reams of paper. Tar paper, writing paper, wrapping paper, oil paper were loaded into the carts. There were lanterns and lantern oil, coffee pots, coffee beans, tea, sugar, flour, nails, hammers, delicate windows, packets of bright candy. All of these things and more. As they waited at the end of the line for their cart to be assessed, Chickadee watched everything around him. He saw his uncle squint hard at the line of traders who were bargaining for each load. The traders wore fancy vests, boots with a harsh shine quickly covered with mud and dust, and white shirts. They had loud, excited voices that dropped to a whisper as they decided on prices. Each had a pad of paper on which he wrote out numbers. Still squinting hard, Chickadee saw his uncle pull a pad of paper and a long pointed feather out of a packet at his elbow. He also had a little bottle filled with a black substance. Uncle Quill dipped his sharpened feather into the ink and began to scratch it across his paper. The traders Uncle Quill had been looking at approached the wagon and gave out a huge guffaw.
"Look here, this savage is riding!"
Several of the other traders craned to see what was going on. Uncle Quill continued calmly to dip his pen in the bottle and to make signs on the paper. 2 more traders came over to see what was happening and gawked at the sight of Uncle Quill, who occasionally brushed his forehead with the tip of the feather and looked into the clouds as if for inspiration.
"What you writing?"
asked one of the traders. Uncle Quill glanced at them through his shaggy hair, then handed over the paper. The first trader read out the numbers on the paper, then frowned. Another trader jostled him, took the paper, and wrote another number down beside Quill's number. Still another trader looked at everything in the cart, grabbed the paper, and wrote down yet another number and handed it up to Quill before a fourth trader could elbow his way over. Quill looked at the number and shrugged. He waited for the last trader to make his way to the cart and handed the paper to him. The last trader kicked one of the other traders in the knee, wrote down a number quickly, tossed the pad of paper up to Quill. Quill read the number, thought a moment, then nodded. The other traders turned their attention to the other carts. Quill followed this trader to his warehouse, where money was counted out to him. Once Quill had counted and recounted the coins, he allowed his cart to be unloaded. After the quick unloading came the next part of the exchange. Quill and Chickadee went to the storeroom next to the trader's fur warehouse. When Chickadee walked into the storeroom, his mouth dropped open. There were bags upon bags of flour, sugar, meal, oats. There were tins of tea and jars of red and white striped sticks, bales of calico and wool, boxes of dried fruit and salted meats. There were tin buckets and stacks of animal traps, knives of every size and shape.
"Here, boy,"
said the trader. He handed Chickadee a striped stick. That was a nice stick. Chickadee looked at it. He'd never seen a stick like this before. He waved it through the air. He tapped it on his hand. Uncle Quill laughed. "Taste it," he said. Chickadee put the red and white stick in his mouth. His eyes opened wide as the sweetness and deliciousness of the peppermint struck his tongue with a blow of joy. He took the stick out with a wild smile. "Uncle," he cried, "Minopokwad, it tastes good." Uncle Quill laughed again and then proceeded to bargain with the goods agent until he had what he needed loaded back into the cart. As Uncle Quill was bargaining, Chickadee slowly enjoyed his first taste of candy. But as he tasted it with every fiber of his being, he thought of Makoons and wished that his brother could be eating a peppermint stick too. When he had licked and nibbled the stick exactly halfway down, Chickadee wrapped it in a stray piece of paper that a trader had dropped on the floor. Then he put the peppermint in the same pouch where he kept his striker. He would keep it for his brother. If only he could give it to Makoons right this minute! Finally, the last decisions were made and the merchandise was piled near the cart. Chickadee and Uncle Quill secured everything with ropes and covered their precious cargo with the buffalo hides kept to protect their wares on the way back. That night, as the ox cart train made camp near the outskirts of the city, Chickadee saw the flicker of candlelight and lamplight high on the hill where the great houses stood. He wondered if he would ever see the inside of one of those houses whose great windows blared sheaves of light. They made huge blurred spears that reached out into the balmy spring darkness. He heard voices up there, tinkly music, and the clatter of hoofbeats as carriages and wagons rolled over the wooden planks and stone pathways. He thought of Makoons again. Could he ever convey this sight in words? He would have to memorize all that he was seeing so that he could tell his brother of what was there. Only his brother would understand, he thought, the black uneasiness that he also felt. It seemed to Chickadee that those houses held the powers of the world. The ones who built and lived in those houses were making an outsized world, an existence he'd never dreamed of, almost a spirit world, but one on Earth. Chickadee could see that they used up forests of trees in making the houses. He could see that they had cut down every tree in sight. He could feel that they were pumping up the rivers and even using up the animals. He thought of the many animals whose dead hides were bound and sold in St. Paul in one day. Everything that the Anishinaabe counted on in life and loved was going into this hungry city mouth. This city, was wide and insatiable. It would never be satisfied, he thought, dizzily, until everything was gone. That night, Chickadee tried to sleep, but he was too excited to drop off into slumber. There was a loud uproar around the fire, and Chickadee decided to watch the dancing and listen to the fiddle music. People from St. Paul were so happy to see relatives from the ox cart train that they brought out extra food. There were many fiddle players sitting on stumps, playing together or taking turns. As they played, they kept time with their feet. The firelight gleamed across their bright eyes, and they played with joy and effort, squeezing up their mouths and bending up and down as they came to the quickest part of their songs. And the dancers! Chickadee now realized that the dancing he'd seen on the way to St. Paul was nothing compared with a real Métis celebration. The men were dressed in their best clothes, stocking caps, fancy berets, with round pom-poms, brimmed hats, striped hats. Their shirts were dripping with ribbons and fringe, and they wore long red sashes, finger-woven like the carrying straps that Nokomis made. The women were even brighter. Necklaces of every color of bead glistened and bounced as they jigged. Their full skirts bounced around their ankles, showing fancy underskirts and colored stockings. Their moccasins, like those of the men, were beaded with intricate flowers. Their hair was held up in silver pins, or braided tightly with ribbons, or swung loose and free as they whirled and tapped. Their feet moved so fast sometimes that they seemed to blur. And all the time they were laughing, the men were smiling, the children were tumbling about, their mouths smeared with food, their eyes brilliant. Chickadee saw Antoinette in a jigging contest with another woman. Each did her fancy steps to the fiddle and then held out a hand to let the other jig. The men clapped and urged them on with delighted cries, and the fiddles never stopped. Sometimes they squeaked high and fast, sometimes they groaned low. Sometimes they brought everyone to their feet. Sometimes, when a fiddler let loose with a wild air, the dancers stopped to clap and encourage the fiddler to greater effort. All of a sudden, Chickadee saw Uncle Quill leap into the middle of the circle. He did not have on fancy clothes, beadwork, a hat, or red leggings, but his footwork was so fast and dainty and his jigging so precise that Chickadee was amazed. Then he disappeared. Other men took his place. The whirl of music and dancing went on for hours, and Chickadee finally could not keep his eyes open for even one more song. He stumbled back to the wagon, crept beneath the cart, and fell asleep even as the Métis people danced, laughed, and drank until dawn. The first cart started moving while the sky was still faintly pink. Chickadee crawled sleepily into the ox cart and snuggled up in the buffalo robe behind his uncle. He checked his pouch to make sure that the half peppermint stick was still there. It was safe. Chickadee dozed off as the cart began its familiar jouncing. He opened his eyes once and smiled, knowing that every turn of the wheel brought him closer now to his twin. Life had sprung up along the trail. A thin green film of green in the trees had become a cloud of new leaves. Robins, bluebirds, vireos, finches, songbirds of all types made the brush along the trail a wall of sharp melody. The broad road went on, and the traveling was very pleasant. Off to the side of the road there were houses, and every so often there was a town to stop at, a settlement where Quill occasionally made a purchase. At one place, he added to the ribbons he'd bought for his wife by buying a hat straight off a woman's head. At another place, he bought a pie. He cut it down the middle, and he and Chickadee ate it right there. Alongside the road, the number of sloughs increased as they left behind farmland and journeyed toward the forest. The road narrowed, then it got bumpy and filled with stumps that could break an axle. There were rocks, branches, mud holes, twisting roots. In the sloughs, high-pitched spring peepers and deep-throated bullfrogs joined in a chorus so loud it could even be heard above the squeak of the wheels. Eagles, hawks, herons, and great flocks of ducks wheeled down and clattered up into the sky as the ox cart train passed. But of course, along with the sparkling sounds of birds and the delicious dinners of duck, spring also brought newly hatched mosquitoes. As they left the flat plains and ventured on up into the forest and prairie lands, the mosquitoes found them. First, it was a slap here, a bite there, but a smudge fire in the night would drive them from the sleeping area. Then things got worse. The insects seemed to be everywhere. At last, one afternoon on a rolling piece of prairie dotted with wildflowers, a spot so pretty that even a young boy would admire it, Chickadee saw a dark cloud wavering ahead. There was no wind. All was still. The cloud gave him an uneasy feeling. He asked his uncle what it was, but Quill didn't answer. When Chickadee glanced at him to see if he'd heard, he saw that Quill's face was contorted by an expression he'd never seen there. Quill's eyes were open wide. He panted, and a small moan escaped his chest. "Get my jacket, my face cloth, my mitts!" Chickadee handed these items to his uncle from the bag in the center of the cart. "Now, you get down! Get underneath the robe, quick!" Chickadee did as his uncle ordered, as fast as he could. By the time he pulled the robe over his head, he heard a strange, whining, vibrating, terrifying roar. And then the cloud descended. The attack was unlike anything Chickadee had ever experienced. He knew what mosquitoes were like naturally. He knew that all too well. But living near a lake, he could escape them by jumping straight into the water. He could cover his body with mud. There were plants as Nokomis smeared on him that the mosquitoes did not like. Out here, there was no place to hide. Everyone was defenseless. Uncle Quill cried out. The poor oxen bellowed. Millions and millions of mosquitoes landed on the flesh of every living being in the ox cart train. The train became a moving mosquito feast. Children cried, men wept and cursed, and the poor animals, whipped by the drivers and tormented by the insects, groaned as they trudged forward. There was nowhere to go but forward. There was no wind, no breeze at all, so the mosquitoes could land and attack at will. Wrapped in the robe, Chickadee got only a few bites at first, but then the biting cloud discovered him too, and great bunches of mosquitoes jammed themselves through every opening, stinging ferociously, sucking his blood out of him with thousands of tiny straws. Chickadee yelled, cried, groaned like the poor oxen, but there was nothing to be done. Every time he smacked away a cluster of mosquitoes, a new ferocious avalanche of them took its place. In a few minutes, he was bitten to pieces. What would happen to him in the hours ahead? He didn't think he could last. Every time he opened his mouth to take a breath, He took a mouthful of mosquitoes in. They filled his nose, his ears, they stung his eyelids, even tried to get his poor eyeballs. The ox cart train was moving as fast as it could, trying to get through the deadly cloud. The beasts were so thickly covered with insects that there wasn't a scrap of hide visible. They were all gray. That terrible, moving, feeding, sucking gray color of mosquitoes. Crying out with pain, the drivers used their whips again and again. To stop was death. A mosquito cloud like this could literally drain the blood from the oxen and the horses, leaving them too weak to pull the carts. So all that day, in a mindless, groaning howl of agony, they plunged along the trail. By nightfall, there was still no wind, and the mosquitoes were unhindered in their viciousness. The ox cart train stopped, and as quickly as possible, smudge fires were lighted. These fires smoked when old leaves and wet branches were added to the flames. The smoke spread over the encampment, and the cloud lifted slightly, hovering just above the smoke, sending down only thousands, not millions, of their number. Uncle Quill covered his ox with a heavy piece of wool. He made the tent underneath the wagon as mosquito-tight as he could. He kept a smudge fire going on each side of the cart, getting up every hour to feed it through the night. It was a torturous night. Chickadee thought nothing could get worse than the attack in the cart, but to fall asleep and then be awakened by the mosquitoes was somehow worse. "Pray for a wind, or rain, or cold," said Uncle Quill. "That's all that can drive them off." Both of them begged for relief before the night was over, but by morning, the mosquitoes raged even more harshly as the pack train started out again. The prairie almost seemed to mock them with its beauty. Every inch of their skins was covered with bites upon bites. Their faces were purple and swollen. The mosquitoes bit through cloth. They bit through hair. They were implacable. Every being suffered. Yet they kept moving. The sun was high in the sky by the time the mosquitoes began to settle. It was unnoticeable at first, and then slowly, infinitely slowly, the cloud of insects broke up into cruel bands and wavering streams. Eventually, in the heat of the day, a brisk wind rose. The mosquitoes, too light to land in wind, diminished. And then at last there was relief. Sweet relief. Almost too sweet to bear. And that was chapter 21 of Chickadee. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will be in touch, and I'll get another chapter or two out to you later this week. Thanks, guys. I hope you're doing okay and having a good week. And don't forget to take a look at what we have on the Google Classroom and the packets that you're going to pick up this Friday. Thanks.